Alright guys, so we're going to do a video on erythrocytes, and I'm just going to be honest with you. I've already done this and apparently the video corrupted, so I'm doing it again about 4 months later without looking at my notes first. So I'm literally doing this cold, so let's just see how smart is Dr. Mashburn. This could be interesting. So y'all hang with me and I will do my best to get this video redone, hopefully uncorrupted, and get you guys back on the road. Alright, so erythrocytes, which are red blood cells. So if you're looking at a blood slide, this would be a picture of red and white blood cells. These pink discs are your red blood cells, also known as erythrocytes. And these large purple cells are your leukocytes, or white blood cells. So let's focus on the erythrocytes in this video. So what basically red blood cells are bags of hemoglobin. Their only job is to carry oxygen and carbon dioxide through your body, okay, to carry oxygen out to your tissues, and then the waste product carbon dioxide to bring that back. Most of the carbon dioxide is actually in the blood, but it does get carried on the red blood cells as well. The cool thing about red blood cells is they have a very specific shape. They're called biconcave discs. They look kind of like a donut with a kind of a thin middle to them. And before red blood cells mature and are released out into the blood, they spit out all of their organelles, even their nucleus. And so they kind of collapse on themselves. And this is good because it makes them very bendy, so they can get into small spaces. They can go through capillary beds in single file. It also allows them to have a very large surface area, relative volume, so they can carry a lot of hemoglobin, which has a lot of iron, and oxygen binds that iron, so it's very efficient at carrying oxygen. Again, they have no nucleus. They're anucleate. It's mostly, if you were to look at the volume of a red blood cell, it's mostly hemoglobin and some water. That's all there is to a red blood cell. They don't have any mitochondria. They don't make any ATP. They don't consume any of the oxygen they transport. So when they're taking oxygen out to the body, it is for those other body organs. They don't use it themselves. Because they don't have any of the organelles, they're very expendable. They don't last very long. And we'll talk about the life cycle of a red blood cell. Again, they're not very big. They can squeeze through capillaries, which is great because that's where gas exchange occurs inside your body. They're filled with a molecule called hemoglobin. I'm going to talk about that. The plasma membrane of these cells has something called spectrin, which again makes it real bendy, flexible, so it can get through these narrow capillaries. And it's what causes your blood to be viscous or thick. And we'll talk a little bit about that when we talk about red blood cell disorders. If you've become very dehydrated, imagine you took a bag of blood, you sucked all the water out of it, all you'd be left with is mostly red blood cells, and that would cause it to be kind of thick and viscous. So it contributes to your blood viscosity. All right. So if you think back to 201, we said form follows function. This is a great example of that. So its form is basically a large surface area cell that can carry hemoglobin and therefore oxygen out to the body. So again, that's its job. It's for respiratory gas transport, okay? And so hemoglobin can bind to oxygen reversibly, so it can pick up oxygen from the lungs and release oxygen out to the tissues. So it's a very reversible reaction. Again, some carbon dioxide also can be carried in the red blood cell. So if you're looking at going into medicine, there's some normal values you kind of want to be familiar with. And so in males, that normal value is about 13 to 18 grams per 100 mLs. And in females, a normal hemoglobin would be 12 to 16 per 100 mLs. This is something you might look at if you're looking to see if someone was anemic. You know, how much hemoglobin do they have? Do they have good oxygen carrying capacities? So what is this hemoglobin I keep talking about? Well, think about to 201, we talked about proteins and protein structures, and maybe you remember that you had your primary structures and then secondary structures kind of twist, and then tertiary structures kind of twist upon each other. If you take a bunch of tertiary structures and hook them together, you get a quaternary structure, and we call that a globin, or a round protein. So this is the globin. And it's actually made up, the hemoglobin is made up of 4 globin chains. You have 2 beta globins and 2 alpha globins that are all hooked together to make this large hemoglobin molecule. Okay? So inside of each globin, you have an iron molecule right there. And the iron is what actually binds to the oxygen. Okay, so the iron binds the oxygen, and that's how you carry the oxygen throughout your body. And so if you look at a red blood cell, each red blood cell is going to contain 250 million hemoglobin molecules. Well, each hemoglobin molecule can transport 4 oxygen molecules. So you have 4 oxygen molecules on each hemoglobin. Each red blood cell has 250 million hemoglobin molecules, and there are over 30 trillion red blood cells in your body at any one time. That's there's millions in each individual drop of blood. So huge carrying capacity to take oxygen throughout the body. When iron and oxygen bind, and so when oxygen binds iron in the hemoglobin, arterial blood, which has gone through the lungs and brought the oxygen back from the lungs to the heart, and it's been bound with oxygen, it's bright red. That's because you've had a kind of a chemical reaction. So imagine if you took an iron nail, put it outside, and it oxidizes, it rusts, it turns out red color. Kind of a similar thing going on with your arterial blood being so red when it's fully oxygenated. All right, so this hemoglobin, again, it binds oxygen. It also can bind carbon dioxide. So I want to talk about some name changes depending on what it's doing. So in the lungs, okay, your blood's going out to the lungs, being pumped from the heart out to the lungs to be oxygenated, to come back to the heart, to be taken out to the body. So you're going to load that hemoglobin, put those oxygens on those irons, okay, and that's called oxyhemoglobin. All right, so what I've got here, this red, this is oxyhemoglobin. It's fully oxygenated blood. All right, this oxygenated blood is going to go out to the tissues, okay, where it's going to start to unload that oxygen. Okay, there's low oxygen levels in the tissue, so the oxygen will diffuse off of the hemoglobin, off the red blood cell, out into the blood and into the tissues. And so as that oxygen comes off the hemoglobin, we call it deoxyhemoglobin. And so that's why your venous blood is darker. It's not as bright ruby red, because you've dropped off all those oxygens. Now as that blood is traveling through the capillaries, it's picking up CO2. You're going to carry it back to the lungs so you can breathe it off. Some of that carbon dioxide will actually bind to the hemoglobin. Most of it's carried through the blood, but some actually does bind to the hemoglobin, and we call that carbaminohemoglobin. So, sounds like a big word. So that's the job of this hemoglobin, to unload and load oxygen from the lungs to the tissues, and then also to pick up some of the carbon dioxide to bring it back to the lungs. Okay? Let's see. Anything else I want to say about that? All right, so one of the things that you need to know about red blood cells is how they're made, and so that's called erythropoiesis. So poiesis is like beginning, erythro, so this is basically to make, or the beginning of red blood cells. And so you're going to make red blood cells in response to low oxygen levels or tissue hypoxia. If you don't have enough red blood cells, then your tissues don't get enough oxygen, and we call that tissue hypoxia. So there's hypoxia, not enough oxygen there. So maybe you've bled out, or you've got some kind of anemic disorder. So that's going to be a signal for your body to make more red blood cells, because you don't want to be hypoxic. But if you have too many, your blood becomes too viscous or too thick. So you've got to regulate it just right so you don't have hypoxia or viscosity. So you want to maintain homeostasis and make sure that you've got just the right amount of red blood cells in your body at any one time. Now, in general, we're making about 2 million red blood cells per second. Wow, that's a lot. But you've got to, again, balance this production and destruction of red blood cells, and so this is going to be under the control of hormones, and also the amount of adequate supply of what you need to make red blood cells. Things like iron, because you have to have iron for hemoglobin. Amino acids. Why would you need amino acids? They're the building blocks to, that's right, proteins. And what's hemoglobin? It's protein. So you have to have that. And also some B vitamins are also important in the production of red blood cells. And we'll talk a little bit about that when we talk about different types of anemia. So when you look at a red blood cell formation, remember these are being made in the bone marrow. So you have a stem cell that's kind of waiting, and it can be programmed to then choose to become a white blood cell, a red blood cell, or whatever it's going to become. So in this particular slide, we've got our stem cell, our hemocytoblast, and it's undergone some hormonal control. Some signal has now committed it to go down the red blood cell line. Okay, so it can't change its mind now and go to a white blood cell. It's going to be a red blood cell. All right, now this red blood cell that's been committed, this pro-erythroblast, is just then going to go through several phases of maturity till finally it becomes a reticulocyte. All right, so these are actually what are sent out into the blood, where they will quickly mature and become the red blood cells that we know to carry oxygen throughout our body. So I don't really usually ask you to tell me all these different stages of development. I just really want you to know the first one, the reticulocyte, and the erythrocyte. Those to me are the important ones for you guys to know right now. So reticulocytes, they enter the bloodstream, and about 2 days they become your mature red blood cells. That's also something you can look for if you're looking at like a lab slide of blood, and you see a lot of reticulocytes in the blood. You may wonder what's causing that person to start to produce so many red blood cells. Why are they dumping so many reticulocytes out in the blood? So that might be a signal that maybe they're hypoxic or something is going on to try to cause them to ramp up their red blood cell production. So you may see that on a lab value, the number of reticulocytes versus the number of mature red blood cells. So I said it was under the control of hormones. We haven't really talked about the endocrine system in detail yet, but we know that's the system that makes your hormones. And the particular hormone that's in charge of erythropoiesis is called erythropoietin, which is nice that they're very similarly named. So erythropoietin causes erythropoiesis. Now, if you ever have an essay question on an exam, hint, hint, erythropoietin, erythropoiesis. Erythropoietin is the hormone. It causes erythropoiesis. It causes the production of red blood cells. Don't interchange them. They don't mean the same thing. So it's a direct stimulus for erythropoiesis. You always have it going on in your system. It's always being released because we're always making red blood cells. But you can increase the amount of EPO. That's the shorthand way of saying erythropoietin. You can increase the amount of EPO if your tissues have become hypoxic. If you have a signal, you need more red blood cells, you're going to make more erythropoietin, send that out into your system to increase the production of red blood cells. Now, it's released from the kidneys in general, some from the liver, but mostly from the kidneys, and so that is where this particular hormone comes from. It's important to note that someone who might have kidney damage, who may be on dialysis, will also have low red blood cells because they don't have enough erythropoietin being made by the kidneys. Sorry, my alarm's going off. All right, so you guys knew this was going to come back. Negative feedback. Anytime we talk about the balance of something, we talk about negative feedback, right? So if you don't remember that from 201, it's a great time to go back to 201, look at your notes, and review what's the difference between negative feedback and positive feedback. In negative feedback, you're shutting off the original stimulus. Remember? So let's talk about that. So our stimulus, okay, is hypoxia, low oxygen levels. All right? Could be because you got stabbed. Maybe you have a decreased red blood cell count because you've been bleeding out. Could be something's wrong with your hemoglobin, it's not working very well. Could be that you don't have enough oxygen available. Maybe you're at high altitude. You've gone up to the top of the mountains, the air is real thin, not enough oxygen, so your body's becoming hypoxic. So any one of these three things could cause hypoxia. Well, there's going to be a stimulus, and your kidneys are going to respond to that stimulus by releasing erythropoietin. Remember, that's the hormone. Well, hormones are released into the blood. It's going to travel through the blood to its target, which is going to be the bone marrow. It's going to go to the bone marrow and cause an increased production of red blood cells. And that's going to release more red blood cells into the system and increase your oxygen carrying capacity. So now you're carrying more oxygen to the tissues. You're increasing the oxygen level in your tissues. You're no longer hypoxic, so you shut down that original stimulus. Negative feedback. Again, go back if you're kind of unsure about negative feedback, because it's going to be a hallmark of 202. I'm going to talk about it over and over and over. And we'll also talk about some positive feedback as well when we talk about hemostasis and labor and delivery. All right, so the hormonal control of erythropoiesis can be caused by hypoxia. Again, these are the three main reasons that you may become hypoxic: reduced red blood cells, insufficient hemoglobin, or reduced oxygen availability. What EPO does is it causes those committed cells, remember stem cells become committed cells, those committed cells start to rapidly mature, and it increases your reticulocyte count. So you send out more reticulocytes into the blood, those will then mature, and then they'll become able to carry oxygen. That's why it can take 2 or 3 days if you go to altitude. So say you fly into Denver to go on a snow skiing trip. You may just be exhausted. It's like you just cannot get enough air, and you're just worn out. About 3 or 4 days later, you feel better. Well, it took 2 or 3 days to increase those reticulocytes into your blood, and for those reticulocytes to mature to bring more oxygen to your tissues. So athletes who need a lot of oxygen try to cheat the system sometimes by giving themselves artificial EPO. So you may have heard of blood doping. So they're giving themselves EPO because it's a hormone. They're hoping they won't get caught. And so by taking this EPO, they kind of trick their body into producing more and more red blood cells. If you have a lot of red blood cells, you have tremendous oxygen carrying capacity. Oxygen's there to make ATP. Muscles use ATP. So you see how this would really help ramp up your physical performance. But it's cheating. And it also has a really serious downside. By taking too much EPO, you can increase your blood viscosity, make your blood too thick, and then you can stroke out. So that's kind of negative. Die of a stroke because you're trying to cheat at the Olympics. Males also tend to have higher EPO levels than females because testosterone will enhance EPO production. So that's one of the reasons a lot of times male athletes are more efficient than females. They have more red blood cells than females do. They have a higher hemoglobin and hematocrit number than females do. More red blood cells, more oxygen carrying capacity, make more ATP, power those muscles. So what do you need for erythropoiesis? Well, it's got to come from your diet. So amino acids, again, to make proteins, lipids. Remember that cell membrane. Cell membranes are made of a phospholipid bilayer. You've got to have lipids in order to make a cell membrane. And some carbohydrates are also needed. You've got to have iron, which is an element that you have to have in your diet. It's you can find it in leafy green vegetables, red meat, or iron supplements. So women, especially who are on their having their menstrual cycle and releasing a lot of blood, sometimes they need iron supplements or eat some more steak or other red meat in order to have enough iron in their diet to make these red blood cells. It's a common problem with people who are like vegetarians. They don't like to eat meat, or they just eat fish or chicken. Not enough iron in fish or chicken compared to red meat, so you may need to take an iron supplement. And then we also store that iron. So we're very stingy with the iron. So with the iron that we have in our diet, but we also recycle a lot of it. So we store about 65% of that iron is stored in hemoglobin. We store it in our liver, our spleen, and bone marrow. So we're kind of stingy. It's something we try to hold on to so we can use it to make hemoglobin and make red blood cells. We also need, again, I said something about vitamin B12, and folic acid is another vitamin that you need. These are required for DNA synthesis, which you need for those committed cells to rapidly divide and make more red blood cells. Okay, so those are things that sometimes people have to have folic acid and vitamin B12 supplements if they're having anemia, hypoxia, things like that. So again, they have no organelles, so they don't live very long, typically 100 to 120 days, because they can't make any proteins, they can't repair themselves, they can't grow, they can't divide. So every time they go through your system, and they're constantly going through your system, and they're squeezing through those little capillaries and bending and twisting, well, they become fragile, and they start to degenerate. And eventually, as they start to kind of rip apart and become degenerate, they get trapped. You have an organ called the spleen, and we'll talk a little bit more about the spleen when we talk about immunity. But it has some kind of like web-like meshes that will catch these red blood cells that are no longer functional, and we can start the recycling process. All right. You also have some macrophages inside the spleen that will digest and engulf these red blood cells, again helping start this recycling process of the hemoglobin and the iron. So this is from your book, and I realize that the picture is very small, but obviously you could open up your textbook and see it bigger and read what it says. But this is the life cycle of a red blood cell. So it starts at the top where you have low oxygen levels, which is going to cause the kidney to produce erythropoietin. Erythropoietin is going to travel to the blood, to the bone. The bone marrow is going to then start that production of more red blood cells. The red blood cells will then go into the bloodstream. As they age, they've been in there 100, 121 days, they start to break down. They're going to be caught by the spleen and to some extent the liver and the bone marrow. Once they're caught, you're going to start the recycling process. And so what you're going to do is you're going to take that hemoglobin, all right, because we're going to recycle that. And we're going to break it down into the heme group and the globin group. Now the globin, that's the protein part, right? So we can break proteins down into amino acids, which is what we do, and we just put those back into the blood so we can recycle those and use those amino acids to make something else. The heme group is then divided or recycled into a bilirubin and an iron. Remember, we're going to save that iron. So we take the iron and then we will store it in the liver and then release it back into the blood as needed during periods of increased erythropoiesis. So you save that iron and then send it back out when it's needed. So that's just kind of the recycling of the globin and the iron. Now the bilirubin is going to then be taken from the liver, and it will then go to the intestine, where well, actually it's secreted into the intestine as part of the bile. We'll talk a little bit more about bile later on, but it's going to be taken to the intestines, where it's really going to give the color to your feces. That's how the color of your feces comes from this pigment of this bilirubin. And so I'm going to go back over here and kind of talk about this bilirubin process. So heme is going to be degraded to something yellow called bilirubin, and so when people have an issue with the bilirubin not being dealt with appropriately, the bilirubin will kind of build up in the body, and you'll get that yellowing of the eyes and the yellowing of the skin. Anybody know what that's called? Jaundice. Okay? So people with liver damage a lot of times will look yellow because their livers are not adequately taking care of this bilirubin. It's building up and causing you to have jaundice. So people with cirrhosis, liver cancer, a lot of things like that, you'll start to see jaundice. If the liver is functioning normally, it will take that bilirubin, it will secrete it into the bile, which is going to go into your gallbladder, and then that's going to be used as part of the digestive process. We'll talk about that later. That's going to be degraded into something called urobilinogen, I can't talk today, and which is then going to be processed to something called stercobilin, and that's what goes out into the feces. Okay, and so that again gives a lot of color to the to your feces. So we try to recycle as much as possible, and that which we don't need is then sent out into the body. Bilirubin can be toxic to your system. It's especially concerning in newborns. You may have heard of a newborn that's born and they start to look jaundiced and they get real worried, so they have you put them out in the light because UV light will break down that bilirubin and let the liver finally catch up and start functioning because they've just been born. Everything hasn't turned on yet. Eventually it will get better. But they don't want the baby to become too jaundiced. Too much yellow, too much jaundice, too much bilirubin buildup can be neurotoxic. So it's very important to monitor your child and watch their color and make sure they're not becoming jaundiced. All right, and that's it. So there you go. I think I did pretty good considering I didn't look at my notes before I made the video. So good luck, and I will see you in the next one.